All right, hi. This is the lecture on chapter 39, which is locomotion and support systems. And we're basically going to end up focusing mostly on the human skeletal and muscular systems. Make sure you have your final exam review sheet and are taking notes as you move through. Also, from a couple of the diagrams, I will point out those muscles and bones that you need to know for the quiz, right? Remember, there will be a quiz this week on just identifying bones and muscles. And then basically everything's sort of fair game for the final exam, but I will not put diagrams to identify on the final exam, okay? All right, so in terms of the outline for this chapter, we'll talk a little bit about some diversity of different types of skeletons within different animals. Then, like I said, we'll focus on the human skeletal and then the human muscular system. Okay, so to start off, just to talk about some different types of skeletons that exist, okay? So when we think about a skeleton, basically it's going to serve as a support system for an animal, okay? Provides rigidity, provides protection, right? And also provides surfaces for muscle attachment, okay? So again, think about the muscular system and the skeletal system work hand in hand in that, you can't just have muscles if they're not attached to anything, right? You wouldn't have the ability to have movement because you need to have some sort of opposing sort of force. So in terms of diversity, right, there are hydrostatic skeletons, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so some examples of animals or groups of organisms that have hydrostatic skeletons, cnidarians, flatworms, roundworms, annelids, okay? And we've talked about this before, right? Exoskeleton. So mollusks, arthropods, right? Lots of insects have exoskeletons. And endoskeletons, echinoderms, right? And obviously also vertebrates. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about these hydrostatic skeletons, okay? So again, in terms of function, supports body form, and again, provides resistance for contraction of muscles to act against to allow mobility. Again, if muscles have nothing to act against, there's no way that the animal would then be able to move. So some organisms like hydroplanarians, they'll actually use their fluid-filled gastrovascular cavity as sort of that means of support. And then also as sort of this sort of rigidity or something that's a little more rigid because of the pressure kind of that's formed by that fluid, muscles can then sort of act against it to provide movement, okay? Annelids will actually use their fluid-filled coelom. Okay, so remember that hydroplanarians don't have a true body cavity, right? And so, but they have this gastrovascular cavity that's filled with fluid. Okay, so for annelids, right, it says each compartment has its own set of longitudinal and circular muscles, right? And its own nerve supply. Okay, so we're gonna look at a picture in a second. And then basically there's alternating contractions of those circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles that allow the worm to essentially move forward, okay? And so this is showing you this here. So again, you can see these circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles, okay? And then basically it's showing you fluid in here. So this cavity is filled with fluid, and that provides that sort of rigidity and structure and provides that opposing force for those muscles to act against, okay? And so this is coordinated contraction and relaxation of these circular muscles, right, and longitudinal muscles that allow that worm to move forward, right? And so again, you can see when the circular muscles are contracted, the longitudinal, and then this is showing you showing you both the circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles contracted. This is showing you then the circular muscles just contract and then it can move forward, right? The longitudinal muscles contract and the segments sort of catch up. Okay, so you can see that sort of movement. If you think about how an earthworm moves, you can think about this coordinated movement between these, or contraction of the longitudinal muscles versus the circular muscles, okay? Now, to sort of stay on the theme of these hydrostatic skeletons, there's also something called a muscular hydrostat, okay? And this is used for movement in animals with exoskeletons, but also in animals with endoskeletons as well. So this is not fluid in the entire body cavity like we just talked about here with the earthworm. This is fluid that's contained within individual cells. Okay, so it's fluid within the individual cells that make up a muscle, and that fluid actually assists with the movement of that part. Okay, so for instance, with clams, they have that muscular foot. That's the kind of part that you definitely don't want to eat. So before you eat a clam, you get rid of that muscular foot. But that muscular foot can extend, and basically there's these muscular hydrostats. The aid of sort of fluid within those cells allows that to happen. Okay, also sea stars, they have these tube feet that allow them to, right, to sort of reach out and grab onto things, and that is made possible by muscular hydrostats. Okay, also invertebrates, movement of an elephant's trunk involves a muscular hydrostat. Okay, so again, this is fluid that's within those individual cells that assists in the movement of that part. Okay, and I don't know if somebody reminds me, or if you're interested, you can look a little bit more into this, right, to see how that works in an elephant's trunk. I think when we're in class, I usually spend a little bit of time on that, but I'll sort of, I don't know, for now, I'll sort of skip it over. If somebody's interested to know more, you know, look it up on your own. Or, you know, we can talk more about it. Okay. So anyway, we move on. Okay. So exoskeletons, right? Like I mentioned, obviously we all should be familiar with an exoskeleton. This is an external skeleton. It's composed of a certain, you know, structural sort of stiff type of material. And it depends on what organism you're talking about in terms of what it's made up of, right? So for instance, mollusks, composed of calcium carbonate, right? So if you think of mollusks and shells, right? Like clams, okay? That shell's going to be composed of calcium carbonate. Arthropods, like insects, the exoskeleton is composed of a carbohydrate called chitin, okay? And obviously with insects, we know that they have to molt or shed that exoskeleton in order to grow, and that does limit their size, okay? Now, if we talk about endoskeleton, and so guys, you should know the difference between an exoskeleton and an endoskeleton. You should also be able to give an example of an animal that has an exoskeleton versus one that has an endoskeleton. Okay, so when we say endo, means internal skeleton. So echinoderms, right, like sea stars, starfish, have endoskeleton, okay? And that endoskeleton is composed of spicules, right? And also plates of calcium carbonate that are sort of embedded within the living tissue of that body wall, okay? And so it's obviously different than when we talk about, different than a vertebrate skeleton. If we talk about sharks and rays, remember we talked about cartilaginous fishes, right? These guys have skeletons that are composed of cartilage, okay? And then we have bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. All of their skeletons are composed of both bone and cartilage, mostly bone, right? Okay, so in terms of advantages of an endoskeleton versus an exoskeleton, and again, I think I've mentioned these before. I mentioned one of them already. So for an endoskeleton, it grows with the animal. Obviously, there's no need to molt or shed an endoskeleton. It's going to grow as that animal grows, and therefore will not limit its growth. It supports the weight of large animals, okay? An exoskeleton, even if it was able to grow with the animal, would never be able to support the weight of a larger animal. It also protects vital internal organs, right? And then the endoskeleton itself is protected by other tissues on the outside of it, okay? And so obviously, also this type of skeleton will allow for flexible and more complex movements, okay? So we should know these advantages, okay? So if I ask you about an advantage of an endoskeleton versus an exoskeleton, we should also be able to describe that as well. All right, so this is basically showing you, right, a bee here that is molting, right, and shedding its exoskeleton. All right, and so this is basically, we just talked about these advantages of an endoskeleton. This is basically showing you a frog, an amphibian, right, and we basically talked about these as well already. All right, so now let's focus on the human skeletal system. So again, if we're going to specifically talk about functions of the human skeletal system, support, right? Protection of vital organs. Some of these are similar to what we just talked about before. Sites for muscle attachment, okay? Also, storage reservoir for ions like calcium, right, and phosphorus, okay? And production of blood cells actually happens inside, right, the bone marrow, okay? And so super important, right? So when we think about skeletal system, we don't only just want to think about, providing structure. There's many other important functions as well. All right. So let's first talk a little bit about sort of forming the skeleton and particularly talking about bone growth and removal, right? So we know that most of the human skeleton is made up of bone. So we're going to need to talk about bone a little bit more. Now, we mentioned bone when we were just talking about tissues, right? And we mentioned bone as being a type of connective tissue. We talked a little bit about some details of bone, but not much. Okay, so a little bit more here. Now, it says here, if we're looking at this first bullet point, cartilaginous structures in early development act as models for future bones, right? So if you think about sort of, if you ever thought about like growth plates and things like that, and so there's this cartilaginous structure that is there first that essentially is that model for the further development of bone, okay? So like I said, eventually they're sort of converted into bones, right? So it says models, right, which are made up of cartilage at first, are eventually converted into bones as calcium salts are deposited into that matrix. So again, if you think about, we've seen a picture of bone, I'll show you another picture, and we said it's a connective tissue, right? But its matrix is very dense, right? And so these calcium salts will get deposited into that matrix and then basically form that really hard structure of the bone, okay? All right. And so if we talk a little bit more here, right, about the formation of bone, okay? So this is talking about in detail this process here, right? So it says endochondral ossification, right? Ossification meaning forming of the bone. So the conversion of the cartilaginous models to bones, I just said that, right? So this is just a little more detail in terms of this process here. And so where this begins in something called the primary ossification center, okay? And we said that cartilage is going to then turn into bone. So that cartilage actually has to get broken down, and it basically gets broken down. Blood vessels start to invade that area, and then those cartilage cells then start to turn into bone forming cells or osteoblasts, okay? And then you get another secondary ossification center that will form, and then basically, that will then start to turn into bone. But it also mentions here that there's a growth plate between the primary and secondary ossification centers will basically keep making growth possible. Okay, but ultimately at one point, growth of the bone is going to cease, right? If we think about, humans, right? You only grow through during a certain period of time. Once you reach adulthood, there's no more growth, okay? And so, you don't maintain this growth plate, and this process doesn't keep occurring. By the way, I'm not going to, ask you specifically about this process here, but I think we should understand that the idea that there is a cartilaginous structure that's there first, that serves as the model, and then that turns into bone, okay, in terms of kind of initial bone growth. All right. So I do want you to know some of these different types of bone cells that exist, okay? So I mentioned osteoblasts, which are bone-forming cells, okay? So these are cells that are going to synthesize new matrix. Think about these as the stem cells of the bone, okay? So they're forming new bone cells. Osteoclasts, on the other hand, are sort of opposite, right? These are cells that will break down bone, okay? They'll remove worn cells. Remember, bone, even though it's very rigid and strong, it's a living tissue, right? And so there's sort of tissue remodeling that's going on all the time. And so osteoclasts are responsible for breaking down some worn bone cells. And therefore then once some of those bone cells are broken down, the calcium actually then gets released into the blood, okay? So it says here they contribute to blood calcium homeostasis. So remember, when I listed those functions of the skeletal system, one of them was, right, a storage reservoir for ions, and I said like calcium, okay? And so in terms of, when your blood calcium levels decrease, then these cells, there's a particular hormone that would stimulate these cells to break down bone so that calcium could be released into the blood. So that's a normal process that happens, right? So super important, again, we're using the term homeostasis, right? That blood calcium levels are maintained at an appropriate level. If those levels drop, right, these cells can then be activated to break down bone, and they're going to break down old, worn or older or worn cells first to then release calcium into the blood. Now you can see if calcium levels keep dropping and you're not getting it in your diet, your body's going to have to keep breaking down more and more bone to keep those blood calcium levels where they need to be for proper functioning, right? And so that's how, you think about osteoporosis, or you think about sort of degeneration of the bone. Well, that's how it might occur. And so again, if you have deficiencies in calcium, the body still has to keep those blood calcium levels at a certain level. And so it would continue to break down bone if necessary. All right, osteocytes, so that was osteoclasts, right? Osteocytes are actually the mature bone cells, okay? So we should know what these different cell types are. So it says osteoblasts become caught in the matrix, and then essentially they mature into these osteocytes. Now, osteocytes will not be able to form new bone cells. So it's the osteoblasts, like I said, are sort of the bone stem cells that can form new cells, okay? All right. Now, if we look at actual bone, like a long bone, right, like your femur, okay, we want to look at sort of the gross anatomy of that bone. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture in a second, and yes, you should be able to identify these sort of main parts of this long bone. Okay, so it says medullary cavity in the center is bounded by compact bone on the sides and spongy bone at the end. So I'm going to show you well, maybe I'll just flip to that picture right here. So we're talking about, right, here's your compact bone, right? And then medullary cavity basically has yellow bone marrow. You can see blood vessels moving through there. This is your compact bone here. On the ends is where you have spongy bone, and that contains the red bone marrow. That's where blood cells are made, in that red bone marrow, okay? And so, yeah, you guys, I could put this diagram on the quiz as well. So you should know that this is compact bone, this is spongy bone. You should also know that the red bone marrow is here, okay? And that this is the medullary cavity. So we should be able to basically identify anything that's on this diagram, okay? All right, so compact bone, it says unit of structure is called an osteon, and we saw this when we did our tissues chapter, and basically that picture of bone that we saw was of compact bone. Okay, the osteocytes, right, lie in these lacuna, these chambers, and you basically have these sort of concentric lacunae that are around a central canal, right? And that central canal contains the blood vessels and the nerves. So that picture, which is here, right, that we saw in our tissues chapter, in order, when you see a picture like this, you should sort of probably be right away able to identify this as bone, okay? And that's compact bone. All right, for spongy bone, okay, it says there's numerous bars and plates that are separated by irregular spaces, right? So there's lots of spaces, hence the name spongy bone, and those spaces are filled with red bone marrow, as I said. This is the site of blood cell synthesis, okay? So again, if we go back to the functions, right, production of blood cells, where is the production of blood cells happening in the bone? In the red bone marrow. Where is that red bone marrow located? At the ends of the bone, in the spongy bone, okay? Let's see, it says skeletal system assists in blood oxygen homeostasis, right, by producing red blood cells. Again, I said all the blood cells are made in the red bone marrow, and obviously white blood cells as well. And so you can see how the skeletal system is going to affect the function, of the cardiovascular system, or in terms of blood oxygen levels, because if there's not enough red blood cells being produced, right, then you're not going to be, your body's not going to have enough oxygen, okay? White blood cells, same thing. If there are not enough blood cells being produced in this red bone marrow, right, you could have a deficiency in white blood cells, and that could then lead to issues with getting infections, right, and immune system deficiencies, okay? All right, so we move on a little bit here. I think I kind of pointed out most of this thing, pretty much everything here, okay? All right, in terms of sort of dividing up the human skeleton, right? And now we're going to talk about identifying some different types of bones, but we want to know, or understand the sort of two main divisions of the skeleton. So we call it the axial and the appendicular skeleton. Okay, the axial skeleton lies in the midline of the body. That axial skeleton is made up of the skull, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, right, your ribs, the sacrum, and the coccyx. Okay, so we should know what makes up the axial skeleton. All of these things we should know, right? So I can definitely ask you about that. So if you look at this picture here, I mean, I'll come back to that again, I think. Yeah, we'll sort of come back to that again. Yeah, I'll flip back to that again just so you know. The one thing that I want to tell you is that what's in red, okay, I want you to be able to identify from these diagrams here. So that's for the quiz, okay, in terms of identifying from a diagram. You'll see there's also some other figures of the skull in particular. You're going to be responsible for some of those bones as well. So any of these diagrams that have things in red, you're only responsible for those in terms of being able to identify them. Remember, I did say you're also responsible, you know, for being able to identify the parts, the sort of gross anatomy of the long bone as well. Pretty much everything that's in here. So that's why I didn't change anything in red. Okay. Here, again, in terms of identifying, it's these in red. All right. So again, we're talking about the axial skeleton is composed of the skull, right? The vertebral column. So everything in blue is the axial skeleton, right? The thoracic cavity of the rib cage, and then also the sacrum and the coccyx. Okay, so everything in blue is axial. Everything that's in beige here is going to be part of the appendicular skeleton. All right. So like I said, I'll probably come back to that and just remind you of that. So if we focus on the bones of the skull, okay, so it's formed by the cranium and the facial bones. Okay, so the skull that's everything part of the skull. In terms of the major bones of the cranium, they're actually named after the lobes of the brain. So we just learned the lobes of the brain in our last chapter, right? Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So the skull, the cranial bones are named after the lobe of the brain that they protect, okay? In terms of facial bones, some of the most prominent facial bones, mandible, maxilla, zygomatic, and nasal bones. Also, when you talk about the skeletal system, you also have to talk about, and we're not going to talk about it too much in here, but if you take a more in-depth anatomy class, right, you'll talk about openings in the bones, right? So one big giant opening is called the foramen magnum, and that's the opening at the base of the skull, and I'm sure you can imagine what goes through there, right? That's where the spinal cord is going to connect to the brain. Okay, so as I said, you know, from these diagrams, you need to identify those in red, okay? So parietal bone, right? Frontal bone, you can see it from this angle as well. Parietal, temporal, okay? Occipital, towards the back. So again, these cranial bones protect those lobes of the brain that we talked about already. Zygomatic, well, I guess I should have highlighted it here too, but this is your cheekbones, right? Maxilla, the top of your jaw. Mandible, the bottom of your jaw. Anything in red, you are responsible for identifying from these diagrams in the quiz, right? So we'll have a bone and muscle quiz this week. Again, identifying from the diagrams will not be on the final exam, but understanding all of the concepts and things like that obviously will, okay? All right. So continuing still with axial skeleton here, right? Vertebral column supports the head and the trunk, protects the spinal cord, obviously, also protects the roots of the spinal nerves, and it is divided into segments, okay? So we should be familiar with these segments. So I'll show you a picture in a second, but it says here going from superior to inferior, going from top down towards the bottom, right? Cervical is the neck region, thoracic segment of your spinal cord, thorax, or basically the thoracic vertebrae are going to attach to your ribs, lumbar, lower back, and then sacral and coccyx, right? The sacrum and the tailbone. Okay. And now between those vertebrae, right, you have discs of fibrocartilage that act as padding. Okay. And so these allow the vertebrae to move in a nice, healthy way, right? So the spine is supposed to be nice and flexible. Okay. So you can bend forward, you can bend backward, you can rotate from side to side. if that fibrocartilage becomes degenerated for whatever reason, right, it can limit movement and cause pain. So you never want those discs to be rubbing on each other. And so a lot of people do have issues with their spine in terms of these discs maybe either degenerating, right, or becoming inflamed or what have you. Okay, so the thoracic vertebrae, like I said, they're part of the rib cage. They attach to the ribs. All right, so we'll see a picture in a second. The rib cage protects the heart and the lungs, as you might imagine. The rib cage is also flexible as well, okay? And we talked about this when we talked about the respiratory system. It has to be able to move outward and upward when you inhale, and then downward and inward when you exhale, okay? So there has to be movement within that rib cage. I mean, in fact, there are, some types of bone disorders, serious ones, where basically, what if that rib cage doesn't form properly because of some sort of degenerating bone disorder or developmental bone disorder, that once that infant is born, they're actually not able to breathe because of this improper formation of that rib cage. So again, another sort of interplay with another system, okay? All right, so in terms of what makes up that rib cage, right? 12 pairs of ribs. So there are true ribs, and when you say it is a true rib, it means it connects directly to the sternum, and there are 7 pairs of true ribs. We talk about false ribs. They don't connect directly to the sternum. There are 5 pairs, 2 of which don't attach to the sternum at all and are called floating, okay? So that's what this is saying. 3 pairs attach by means of a common cartilage, so not directly. 2 pairs don't attach at all. Those are those floating ribs. Okay, so if you look at the rib cage here, right, we said true ribs, 7 true ribs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each of them connects directly to the sternum by some cartilage, okay? That's obviously going to provide some flexibility, right? And the ability for it to basically expand and sort of contract, right? You can see here these false ribs, these guys are going to connect via the same cartilage, and so that's why we say they don't connect directly. And then you can see 11 and 12 here don't connect at all. Those are those floating ribs. So 7 pairs of true, 5 pairs of false. Of those false ribs, 2 of them are floating. Okay, so what do we mean by true? They attach directly to the sternum, right? Here's your sternum, right here in the middle. Okay, now, so that was all axial skeleton, right? We went through, we described some bones of the skull, facial bones, which are all part of the skull, right? Cranial bones, facial bones, part of the skull. We talked about the vertebral column, different segments of the vertebral column, and then we talked about the rib cage, okay? Now you can move on to the appendicular skeleton, which consists of the bones within the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdles, okay? So these, and the bones that are attached to the limbs, okay? So everything in the center, skull, vertebral column, right? And thoracic cavity, the ribs are all part of the axial skeleton. Appendicular are the bones of the limbs, but also include the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle as well. Okay, so it says pectoral girdle and upper limbs are specialized for flexibility, right? Think about it. I mean, think about your shoulder joint and how much mobility you have there, okay? And then if you think about the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs, they're going to be more specialized for strength. Obviously, you still have flexibility and mobility, but they are going to need to be stronger, right, to support your weight. Okay, so if we look at that pectoral girdle specifically, right, bones of the shoulder, like I said, these support the arms and the hands, and they are specialized for flexibility. And actually within that, they end up getting injured a lot, right, because they have so much mobility and flexibility. So some bones to point out, right, clavicle, okay, the collarbone will connect the sternum, okay, the breastbone, the sternum, and the scapula, which is your shoulder blade, okay? Some other upper limb bones, and again, remember you're responsible for identifying those bones that are in red from on this diagram. But again, I mean, I could also, so any of those bones that are in red, I could also show those bones using this diagram instead, right? Instead of that overall diagram. Okay, so you're responsible for identifying those bones no matter what diagram I use. Okay, all right. So If we talk about upper limb bones, right? Humerus, ulna, radius. So humerus is that upper arm, right? And then lower arm, ulna and radius. Obviously, you got bones of the hand, you got bones of the fingers, right? The wrists. And so we can look at that in a little more detail here. So like I said, I can show you or use this diagram. I can use the other diagram I showed you before. But remember, you're responsible for those that are listed in red. So this is showing you the clavicle here, right? Which is going to attach to the breastbone over here or the sternum, but then also to the scapula, okay? This is showing you the humerus, right? And then the ulna and the radius. And so notice where the thumb is when you're trying, so don't get confused identifying the radius versus the ulna. When we're talking about anatomical position, right? If you kind of stand up with your arms at the side, you're going to turn your palms facing out. So your thumbs are pointed away from your body, right? And that's the way we're looking at this here, okay? So this is looking at your bicep here is facing you. Or this, what you see in this picture is that person's bicep facing out. Again, their thumbs are turned out away from their body. Okay, so kind of do that with yourself right now and sort of rotate those palms facing outward and the palms facing forward, right? Thumbs facing out away from the body. All right, so again, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, we should be able to identify these. Okay, if we talk about lower limb, right? Pelvic girdle, okay, consists of hip bones anchored to the sacrum, and they form that pelvic cavity, okay? And so it says body weight is transmitted through the pelvis to the lower limbs and then to the ground. And again, obviously these are specialized for strength. Okay, if we talk about bones of the lower limb, femur, tibia, fibula, femur, right? Thigh bone, biggest, longest bone in your body. Tibia and fibula are part of the lower leg, okay? Similar terminology here to the hand and the fingers. Sorry, I got to sneeze. Sorry. Excuse me. So 7 tarsal bones compose the ankle. Metatarsal bones form the arches of the foot, and those are basically the foot bones, metatarsals. And then the bones of the toes are called the phalanges. The bones of the fingers also called the phalanges, okay? And so you can see a picture of this. This is, again, showing you the coxal bone, right? And so essentially the hip, right? Hip girdle here, or pelvic girdle. And then you can see the femur attaching into that joint there. Here's your femur, right? Here's your knee joint. And your tibia, which is your shin bone, right? And then the fibula is sort of out to the side, which is that skinnier bone. And you guys that watch sports may have, there's definitely a couple examples of this depending on what you're watching, but there's definitely been things that have been caught on camera in terms of a compound fracture of the fibula, actually sometimes both the tibia and the fibula, right? And then you can actually see those bones sticking out. There's one, I think it was a college basketball game, where it's like right in front of the bench, basically these 2 bones sort of snapped in half and they were basically sticking out, obviously ridiculously painful. But I think there's also some football footage where you can see that type of injury as well. Okay, also just to point out the patella, right, or the kneecap here as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk, that's all we're going to say about the skeletal system. There's obviously a lot more to talk about in terms of the skeletal system. I think we sort of hit the high points, but again, we can spend a lot more time talking about it. So let's just kind of take it for what we talked about here. For the quiz, be able to identify these bones from those diagrams, which I pointed out throughout. But for the final exam, it's understanding concepts, everything that I basically just went over, okay? All right, so moving on to the muscular system. So muscles, right? Again, we talked about muscles or muscle tissue in the tissue chapter, okay? And so it says muscles are composed of contractile tissue, which is capable of changing its length by contracting and relaxing, hence the name contractile tissue, right? So muscles are made up of tissue that can contract and relax. Animals are going to rely on muscles for movement. Okay, it says only a few animals are non-modal or sessile. And we talked about some of those sessile animals, in previous chapters, and most of them are marine. and live in aquatic environments. Why? Because they don't have to move to get their food. They can sort of siphon in the food from the moving water, right? So the currents kind of help them obtain food. Obviously, if an animal's terrestrial, it's not going to work out too well if they're sessile, okay? Different types of muscle tissue, we talked about this before, okay? Smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. If we actually now look at the anatomy of skeletal muscles, okay? So that's what we're going to look at. We will look at the microscopic anatomy as well. All right, so in terms of, oh, I don't think I marked in red what you need to know. I'll probably do that as I'm on with you guys, okay? In terms of those muscles that you're going to be responsible for, just like I did for the bones. I think I forgot to do it, but maybe not. I might have. Okay, so we'll see when we get there. Skeletal muscles, right, are attached to the skeleton. Okay, so we're mostly going to be talking about skeletal muscles here. Hence the name, they are the voluntary muscles that are going to provide movement. Okay, and they're attached to the skeleton by bands of fibrous connective tissue called tendons. Right? Remember, we talked about different types of connective tissue. We talked about dense fibrous and loose fibrous connective tissue. Tendons are going to be, are made up of fibrous connective tissue, okay? They're arranged in antagonistic pairs. So what do we mean by that? Those are sort of opposites, right? And so when one is pulling or when one is contracted, the pair, right, its partner is going to be relaxed. And so that's what we mean by antagonistic pairs. So think about bicep and tricep. Okay. Muscles can only pull. They cannot push. So the force that they exist is pulling. When they contract, they can pull, and then they're just relaxed. They cannot push. Okay. All right. So I already said this here. When one muscle of a pair, right? Think about biceps and triceps, flexes at the joint and bends the limb. Its antagonist, right, extends the joint and straightens the limb, okay? So they're in opposing action of one another. A muscle at rest, will exhibit tone, right? So there's something called tone, meaning minimal contraction. So I guess you can think about your muscles as never being completely relaxed, right? Otherwise you would have no posture or structure at all. There's always a sort of minimal amount of contraction that we call tone, okay? And so as I said, it's sort of important in maintaining posture. If you think about your spine, right? There's lots of little muscles that support that spine. If those muscles that support the spine were able to be completely relaxed, you would like slump over, right? So there always has to be this maintenance of tone, okay? It says there's muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. These are essentially sensors within the muscles that are responsible for maintaining that tone, okay? It says muscle contraction builds or summates until maximal sustained contraction or tetany is achieved. And so muscles can reach this sort of maximum amount of contraction, right? So we're sort of mentioning this sort of low end where you have this minimal amount of contraction called tone versus its maximum contraction called tetany. Okay, I did do it. So in terms of those muscles that you need to be able to identify for the quiz, they are labeled in red, okay? So orbicularis oris, right, is a facial muscle around your lips, and so it allows you to pucker up those lips. Trapezius, right? Right here, if you think about shrugging your shoulders, right? Trapezius or traps. Pectoralis major, chest muscle. Deltoid, shoulder, okay? Biceps. Rectus abdominis, okay? I think we can look at these ourselves and be able to identify. And as you're identifying these, looking at the diagram, probably helpful to point them out on yourself, helps you remember. And also think about kind of what action happens as a result of contraction of that muscle. So for example, if you think about quadriceps femoris here, which is a group of muscles, but it's the front of your thigh, right? Your quads. If you contract the quadriceps, what does that do? The leg causes the leg to straighten, okay? And when that leg is straightened, right, the hamstrings, the back of the leg is, those muscles are relaxed, okay? So that's that antagonistic pair. Biceps and triceps work pretty similarly, right? Bicep contracts, that bends the arm at the elbow joint. When triceps contract, that straightens the arm. All right, so gastrocnemius is your calf muscle, okay? All right, and so I've been basically saying this the whole time, but if you want to have a little diagram of antagonistic muscle or the action of antagonistic muscle, again, I gave the example of biceps right, and triceps, okay? So when the arm is bent at that elbow joint, biceps are contracted, triceps are relaxed. When the arm is straightened, biceps are relaxed and triceps are contracted. Again, do that with your own arm and put your hand on your biceps and your triceps and feel them contract and relax, okay? All right, now we got to get into the microscopic anatomy of the muscular system, right? Or of the muscle. Because again, when we think about contraction and relaxation, how does that occur? It's on the microscopic level. What's happening in those muscle cells? That's what causes contraction, okay? That's why when we need to understand biology or understand physiology, you always have to think about what's happening on that cellular level. Okay, that's the sort of origin of any function that we're going to talk about. All right, so just a couple parts of the muscle cell to point out, okay? Sarcolemma, and so it's going to be analogous to the plasma membrane. So when you think about a general cell, right, we talked about the plasma membrane on the outside. In a muscle cell, you're going to call that a sarcolemma, okay? And then it has these sort of extensions or sort of invaginations of the sarcolemma that are called T-tubules that will sort of protrude kind of inside the cell. We'll leave it at that. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is basically the endoplasmic reticulum in muscle cells, okay? And there's basically calcium ions that are stored there, right? So when we talked about skeletal system, I talked about calcium, homeostasis, right? And how important calcium is for the function of the body. Well, particularly for muscle cells. Calcium is needed for muscle cell contraction. Calcium is also necessary for neurotransmitters to be released, okay? So proper levels of calcium are particularly important for the function of the nervous system and for the function of the muscular system, all right? Also, if we talk about that muscle cell, there's something called myofibrils. Okay, and these are contractile structures in the sarcoplasm. So again, sarcoplasm, just like cytoplasm of the cell. So these myofibrils will make up the inside of the muscle cell, okay? And those myofibrils contain light and dark bands, right? That's the striation part of it, of the skeletal muscle. If we want to have another term here called a sarcomere, this is what we name the unit of contraction on the myofibrils. Okay, and basically that sarcomere is primarily made up of two proteins, myosin and actin. Okay, so if we think about the contraction of muscle, we have to talk about the sarcomere. The sarcomeres are the contractile units of the muscle. Okay, and again, what are the two main proteins involved in contraction? Myosin and actin. Okay, we should know this terminology, guys. We certainly should know that the sarcomere is the contractile unit of a muscle cell, and that myosin and actin are two main proteins involved in muscle contraction, two main proteins that are part of the sarcomere. Okay, we're going to talk more about this. Now, when you talk about the sarcomere and you talk about contraction, there's something called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. Okay, so again, just to kind of summarize, but we're going to see a picture in a second. So actin filaments are found at both ends of the sarcomere. Okay. One end of each of these actin filaments is attached to something called a Z-line at the end. Okay, so the Z-lines are sort of the ends of the sarcomere. The other end is basically suspended in the sarcoplasm, and then there are myosin filaments that are suspended between these Z-lines. Okay, so it'll make more sense when we see a picture. All right, so again, let me just sort of describe it in words, but then let's look at the picture and describe it again. When a muscle fiber contracts, okay, actin filaments will slide past the myosin filaments and basically approach one another. And so that sarcomere will shorten, okay? So the Z-lines will move towards each other. Like I said, the sarcomeres will shorten, but the filaments remain the same length. They're just going to overlap each other more, okay? So this is the sliding filament. The actin filaments slide past the myosin filament. That's where the name sliding filament comes in. The other thing to point out is that working muscles, as you might imagine, require energy, right? Require ATP. Okay, it says myosin filaments break down ATP and form cross bridges that then pull those actin filaments towards the center of the sarcomere. So if ATP is not available, right, muscle contraction can't occur. Okay, so it says sustained exercise requires cellular respiration to regenerate ATP, right? Obviously, if you're doing some sort of strenuous exercise, you got to make sure your body needs to be very efficient at generating ATP. All right. So let's look at this with a series of diagrams here. So in terms of the muscle fiber structure and function, again, just to kind of start big picture here, right? Here's a whole muscle. So think about your bicep, okay? Within that muscle, okay, a muscle contains bundles of muscle fibers, and one muscle fiber has many myofibrils. So bundles of muscle fiber in a muscle, and a muscle fiber is a muscle cell, okay? So here you go, within a muscle cell, you have a whole bunch of myofibrils, okay? And then here's your muscle fibers, here's an individual muscle cell, right? And then inside the individual muscle cell, right, or muscle fiber is myofibrils. The sarcomeres are part of the myofibrils. They're basically lined up like train cars on the myofibrils, okay? Each sarcomere contracts using what we just described, that sliding filament model. So there's lots and lots and lots of contraction in each of those sarcomeres that are going on that all combine together to form contraction of that entire muscle, okay? So a whole bunch of myofibrils in one muscle cell. All those sarcomeres on the myofibrils contract, that muscle cell contracts, and then a whole bunch of other muscle cells are going to contract that are part of that entire muscle to cause that entire muscle to contract. So there's lots of individual sort of contraction that's going on that then ultimately leads to contraction of that whole muscle, okay? All right, so a little bit more here. Now this is looking just at the myofibril, right? So here's your muscle fiber, your muscle cell, right? You can see this is that. What did we talk about? We mentioned the parts of the muscle fiber, right? Sarcolemma, right? Which is like the plasma membrane. Here's sarcolemma, okay? So again, and then you can see, we're going to focus in on these myofibrils, but they basically pack the whole muscle fiber. You can see here, this is the nucleus. Remember we said that skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, okay? And basically you see the nucleus is really close to the surface, right? Because the whole entire cell is filled with these myofibrils. All right. Now, if you look at this myofibrils, right here, here's a sarcomere, and then here's another one here. Like I said, they're lined up like train cars along these myofibrils. All right, we go more now. It's labeling everything for you. Everything that we talked about. By the way, I could definitely use this diagram on your little muscle and bone quiz and ask you to identify these parts here, okay? Because it's just as important to understand the microscopic anatomy as it is to be able to identify whole muscles, all right? So this is fair game. And like I said, I'm not labeling anything in red, just like I said with the gross anatomy of the bone picture, because you should be able to identify everything that's on these pictures here, okay? All right, more. Now, like I said, this is a sarcomere, okay? Each one of them they're lined up like train cars along every single one of these myofibrils. Okay, so here's showing you one sarcomere. Here's your Z line, okay? All right, and so now if we look at sort of pictorially what's in here, right? We can see these filaments, okay? Actin and myosin, like we talked about right here, actin and myosin, right? And then this is showing you this cross bridge. Remember we mentioned that ATP is required for the formation of this cross bridge. So we say that actin slides past the myosin, right? That sliding filament. These filaments slide past each other when this contracts. Well, how does that actually happen? Myosin has to grab onto that actin. And remember that process is dependent on ATP. Muscles need lots and lots of energy. Okay? All right. So this is showing you these. The other thing is too that I didn't really point out, and it's on here. When we talk about sort of the function of the sarcomere and what's happening during contractions, there's also another way of sort of labeling different regions, right? So it shows you this, it's labeling I band versus H zone versus A band and Z line. Okay, so these are sort of characteristic parts of the sarcomere that are basically identified because it makes it easier just sort of to describe what's happening at those points. Okay, you don't need to memorize what the Z line is, what the H zone and what the A band is. All right, just so you know. Okay, so you can see here, sarcomeres are relaxed, right? And now they're contracted. What do you notice? Those filaments slide past each other. The whole sarcomere gets shorter, right? But you don't like lose any of the filaments, the actin and the myosin, they just get closer together. Okay? So we should be familiar with everything that's here. Again, I probably will include this on your quiz. Okay? And for the final exam, we need to understand what, understand this process. Okay. Again, you don't need to know what the H zone, the A band, and the I band is, but basically you can kind of see here, right? The H zone corresponds to just a part of the sarcomere where it's just myosin here during relaxation. But then if you look at that H zone here, you got actin and myosin in there. Okay. So, but don't worry about these. That's the one thing that you don't really have to worry about on this diagram. And also we didn't describe that at all. So for the final exam, I'm not going to ask you what makes up the Z line or what makes up the A band. Okay. All right. So moving on, just to mention something here about Botox. Okay. So again, if we were in class, I'd probably give you a handout on this. We read it. We talk a little bit more about this. But I think it's sort of nice to try and kind of just mention this. So Botox, right, stands for botulism toxin. Okay. And it's produced by a specific bacteria, Clostridium botulinum. Okay. And it says it's one of the most lethal substances known. Okay. And so it's a toxin that basically is lethal. However, if you just inject it into the muscles of the face or what have you, it's not going to be lethal, obviously. And so it says here, the pure form allowed scientists to determine that the toxin acted by preventing nerves from communicating with muscles. Okay. So again, this is if you ingest a large amount of it, it's toxic. Okay. And so it says scientists soon began using the toxin to treat conditions in which the muscles contract too much. So it actually was used to treat eye conditions first. So actually, problems with the eye muscles that then would affect vision. Okay, so it was used for that first. However, once it started to be used for that, this ophthalmologist actually noticed that the treatment caused the facial wrinkles on our patients to subside, right? And so then, I guess conveniently, right, her husband was a dermatologist, and so she basically convinced him to use this to reduce wrinkles. I don't know how true this part is, but whatever. So obviously now people use it. It's very widely used to reduce the appearance of wrinkles, okay? And that basically it prevents those muscles, those small muscles there from contracting, and those wrinkles subside, okay? It's also now used a lot to treat chronic migraine headaches. Also excessive underarm sweating, okay? The only thing is you have to have multiple injections, right? So that it sort of wears off, and so every 6 months or so, you have to be injected again. All right, so anyway, obviously involves the muscular system. Also, I think it's kind of an interesting story because this is kind of a lot of times how things work in science, right? Something being used for something else, and then that scientist or that clinician notices some other effect, right? And so that's the case with this as well. All right, so this is showing you here, right? Again, it has to be locally injected, right, in small amounts in certain areas. And then, like I said, it will wear off and then would have to be re-injected after a certain amount of time. Okay. All right. So this kind of moves into or kind of fits into this next topic, right? We said Botox here acts by preventing nerves to communicate with the muscles, right? So what stimulates the muscles, right? Those muscle cells to contract. We just went through that sliding filament, concept of muscle contraction. Essentially that's happening in those muscle fibers. Well, what stimulates that process? Okay. And it's a nerve, right? It's the nervous system that stimulates it. And so neuromuscular junction is basically, it says the synaptic contact between a nerve fiber, right? So that's between an axon of a neuron and the muscle fiber. Okay. So these neurons, right? Remember when we talk about a nerve, we're talking about axons, right? Part of neurons. So, basically the nerve impulse, the action potential, right, travels down that axon. And then at the end, it's going to release acetylcholine. Okay, that acetylcholine. So again, think about our last lecture on the nervous system. Think about, we talked about action potential. Again, nerve impulse, action potential traveling down the axon. right? And then we talked about, well, what happens once that nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon? Neurotransmitter is released. At the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is released. It crosses the synaptic cleft, or it's emptied or sort of released into that synaptic cleft, and then it binds to the muscle fiber, okay? Acetylcholine binding to the muscle fiber basically signals or triggers the muscle fiber to contract, okay? And so I think this is my last slide. Yeah. So again, you can spend lots and lots of time on these details here. If you can see, well, one thing is kind of cool to look at is actually you can see an electron micrograph, which is showing you these terminals, right? Different axon terminals that are basically ending on different muscle fibers here. Okay. And you can kind of see this in pictorial form as well. So here's your, here's your nerve, right? I guess this is just showing you really just one axon here. So let's just say this is one axon, okay? One axon, myelinated, action potential moves down. And remember that, axons have multiple terminals that can then innervate multiple muscle cells, okay? What's released here is acetylcholine, right? That acetylcholine then binds to the muscle fiber and basically causes muscle contraction. Now, there's lots of other details to talk about here in terms of how this happens, but I guess that's for another time, right? There are many courses where you can go over this in detail. You go over it probably a little bit more detail in anatomy and physiology. Also, an upper level physiology course, a neurobiology course can go over this process in some more detail. One thing to point out, and I kind of just like to give this sort of little extra piece of information here. And I think maybe I did mention this in the nervous system chapter as well. So again, you can see here's your acetylcholine being released, right? The green into the synaptic cleft. It will bind to the muscle fiber here and then basically stimulate it to contract, right? Also, you can see this little blue triangles here. If you notice, these are called acetylcholinesterase. And so that's an enzyme. Remember, we say anything that ends in ACE is an enzyme, okay? And so this enzyme is basically going to break down the acetylcholine, okay? And so the function of acetylcholinesterase is to break down acetylcholine and remove it so that it's removed here. Because if acetylcholine just hangs out here and was never removed, it would keep contracting this muscle, okay? And let's think about one thing. Remember your diaphragm, or if you think about respiration and breathing, okay? When you think about inhaling and exhaling in the sort of mechanical aspect of breathing, right? Your diaphragm has to be able to contract and relax, okay? So what would happen if you were exposed to some drug or some agent that basically inactivated acetylcholinesterase and basically just kept acetylcholine around, right? In basically those neurons that would stimulate the diaphragm muscles. If that acetylcholine was always around and was never removed, it would just keep that diaphragm in its contracted state. So if that diaphragm was never able to relax, what does that mean for the mechanical aspects of breathing, or actually the active breathing? Will you be able to breathe? The answer is no. Okay. So is there something that acts that way? Absolutely. Right. So nerve gas, sarin. Okay. That's how it kills you. It blocks acetylcholinesterase activity basically irreversibly, and you suffocate because of its action essentially on the diaphragm. Okay, so I guess that's not a good note to end on, but I think it kind of is a good example of the function of acetylcholinesterase, the function of acetylcholine. It's also a good sort of application of understanding the neuromuscular junction. Okay. So that is it for the muscular system and the skeletal system. Again, remember, we will have a quiz on all those diagrams that I pointed out here in terms of being able to identify, okay? Even this diagram, maybe I would use this and ask you, tell me, what this is in terms of the acetylcholine being released, right? But for the most part, I'll flip through in terms of those diagrams that will probably be included on the quiz. This one, right? And being able to identify basically essentially almost everything on here except Z-line, A-band, H-zone, okay? Also, and so sorry, this is animated this way. Also being able to identify muscles, right, that are in red here, okay? In terms of the bones, I may use a diagram like this, right? A diagram like this. Even this diagram is fair game. We should know what are the true ribs and what are the false ribs, okay? In terms of identifying different parts of the vertebral column. Gee, where did I have that? I mean, I guess I don't really have that on here, so I guess you're safe from that. But we should know that, and for the final exam, that cervical region is towards the neck, right? Thoracic are the vertebrae that are attached to the ribs. In terms of identifying bones from this diagram, all of those that are listed in red, and like I said, I can also use these diagrams as well, okay? In terms of the bones of the skull, right, the cranium and the face, I'll most likely use a diagram like this, and we should be able to identify anything in red here. Okay, I think I got most of it. Oh, that was another one too here. In terms of knowing the gross anatomy of the long bone, we should be familiar with that as well. All right, and so that is it. That concludes our lecture, and that's our last lecture, guys. So you don't have to listen to me anymore. Thanks, guys.